Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be using the Penny Black stamp set Merry Making as well as the Falling Snow stencil by Simon Says Stamp. I have a piece of Neenah Desert Storm cardstock, and this is cut down just a little bit smaller than an A2 size card. It's 4 by 5 1/4. Going to use my Mini Misty here and stamp this out twice with Fade Out ink by Ink on 3, just to make it easier for you guys to see on camera. For my background, I wanted to add a little bit of falling snow with the falling snow stencil. And I'm just going to use some Post-it note tape to tape my panel down to the back of my stencil. Going to use some pigment ink. I'm going to be using White Unicorn Pigment Ink by Hero Arts. You can use any pigment ink for this or any kind of opaque white ink. I'm using a blending buddy brush by Trinity Stamps, and I'm just going to go ahead and go over this stencil. I'm kind of pouncing on some of the color there, and I'm just being careful not to go directly over my image. Being we're going to be using colored pencils, it's not the end of the world if we do, but I can see my image kind of through that stencil, so I kind of know where I need to stop with my ink blending. And also these particular brushes kind of come to a point, so I'm able to get into those little areas around my image without actually going over it. You can use any blending brush here, and you can actually use an ink blending tool, sponge, whatever you prefer. So once my ink blending was complete, I'm going to go ahead and remove my stencil. Keep in mind that this is a pigment ink, so it will take a few minutes to dry. So you just want to be careful not to smear that ink. So once that's done, we're going to move right into the coloring, and I'm going to be using my Polychromos pencils today. And just to warn you, I am no expert when it comes to colored pencils, so I'm keeping this very, very simple. You're probably not going to learn any special techniques or anything from me when it comes to colored pencils. This is kind of the lazy way to use your colored pencils. So I'm starting off with this snow. And I'm using some cool gray markers here as well as my white pencil. I'm going right in with my darkest color, but you can kind of see that I have the pencil kind of tilted down to the side. And that's because I'm using more of the side of the tip of the pencil. And I'm using a pretty light hand with my grays. I wanted to add the shading where the snowy hills are and underneath each one of these little characters. And I'm just blending that out a little bit further each and every time that I kind of move down towards the white. And once I bring in the white, you'll see that I use my white pretty often. It's so small. It's almost unable to hold on to at this point, but you'll see also that I'm sharpening my pencils often in between, and this will just give you a better blend if you have a really good point to your pencil and you're able to get into those smaller areas. I also added just a little bit of shading on either corner just so that I didn't have too much white space, but I'm just blending everything out with that white pencil. Next, I'm taking a pen here, and this is just an EK Success journaling pen because I have it sitting on my desk, and I'm just going to go over their little eyes and their noses and things like that so that I don't lose them once I start my coloring. The fade out ink is exactly what it says it is. It fades away once you do your coloring over it. So for the snowman, I'm going to use the same color combination as I did for the snow. He's kind of facing off towards the left, so I'm adding a little bit of shading to the right-hand side. And you can see that I'm just kind of going along with the shape of the snowman itself. And then again, I'm going to take that white pencil and I'm going to go over all of that shading and then into that white space. For the bottom portion of the snowman, it's going to be pretty similar. However, there's going to be more shadows here. The scarf is going to cast a shadow. That little bunny that's sitting in front of him was also going to cast a shadow, as well as the right-hand side. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit more shading on that side as well. But I am using the same grays. I started off with a light hand with my darkest, continuing on with a light hand with all of my shading. And then once I'm happy with that, I can kind of go over everything, including the shading with that white pencil with a little bit heavy-handed. Not too heavy-handed where I can't add more shading if I need to, but once I'm happy with it, then you can kind of press a little bit harder. Once you have I don't want, it's not ink, but I guess once you go over the same area multiple times, you're not going to add any more color to that. So it's best to go in with a light hand to start with, and then you can always add more shading if you need to. For the bunny, I'm going to switch over to some warm grays here, and I'm not going to go quite as light as I did with the snowman and the snow on the bottom, but I'm pretty much doing my shading the same way. I am adding a little bit of shading inside of his little ears and where his foot is kind of coming up and one is behind it. There's going to be a shadow there underneath his little scarf, and above his little nose or his little snout, I guess you could say, there's a little curvy line within the stamped image. So I'm just using that as a guide to put a little bit of shading above that so that his face has a little bit of shape to it. But again, I'm going in with a lighter hand with that darkest color, blending that out with the midtones. Again, lighter hand. I've heard that you can, or you're supposed to, kind of go in like little circular motions when you're blending. I've done that before, but honestly, I didn't see much of a difference. And that could be just because my skills are lacking, I should say, for my colored pencils. So I like to keep everything simple and do what's most comfortable for me. So whether it be colored pencils, Copics, alcohol markers, watercolor, whatever it is, it's great to kind of learn from other people. But at the end of the day, do what's best for you, do what works for you. I'm not worried about comparing myself to the people that are experts when it comes to colored pencils, because I'm not an expert and I don't intend to ever be an expert. So I just have fun with it. And as long as it looks halfway decent, I'm fine with it. So I added just a little bit of pink to the inside of his ears and his cheeks with the medium flesh color. If you are using polychromos, I'll let you know all of the colors pretty much, except for the warm grays and cool grays. I think you guys can figure that out. For this little character, honestly, I didn't know what it was, but I saw that it had some stripes. So I'm going to color this as a cat with some stripes. So a tabby cat, kind of like my Frankie. And I'm going to add a little bit of shading to the stripes first. And here's where I'm going with a very, very heavy hand, so that when I color the rest of him, I can go directly over those stripes without them blending in with the rest of him. Like I said, once you add enough color or go in with an extremely heavy hand, you're not going to be able to blend that out any further. So I started off with the stripes, then I'm going to move to the rest of his body, and I'm going to keep with some cool grays here, but I'm adding more shading to the left-hand side this time, being he's facing off towards the right. Also where his little, it's not a snout when it comes to a cat, but whatever it is, the area where his nose is. I'm adding some shading above that and on the very base of it so that I have a little bit of variation in color. What I try to do, especially with no line coloring, I try not to put two shadows or two dark areas directly next to one another so that you can differentiate between the two objects or two different sections of those objects. So sometimes I do have to go back and add more shadows or try to lighten up certain areas if I happen to have two of those dark areas right next to one another. So I'm just continuing to blend this out a little bit further. For his little paw, or his paw, his leg, or his front leg, is the same color as the rest of his body, but his front little paw there, I wanted this to be white. So I'm using pretty much the same colors as I did for the snow, and just making sure that I actually bring in that white pencil to keep a majority of it white. Just like I color everything with Copics, where a white object still has shading, it's going to be the same with your pencils. So I'm using a majority of the white, but I am still adding some shadows. Now, I wasn't happy with the contrast I was getting for the rest of his body, so I went back in with some of those darker grays, and because I went in with a light hand, I can go in and add just a little bit more shading and still be able to blend that out. So once I was happy with the coloring of the cat, I realized that everything was blending in with the snow way too much. So I ended up bringing in a light blue marker, or not marker, pencil. I'm so used to Copics. This is a sky blue, and I'm just with a very, very light hand going over all of the snow. And this is just going to give a little bit of a bluish tint to it without it actually being blue. And this will kind of make everything stand out a little bit more and not blend in so much. So next, moving on to the hat, I'm starting off with the black pencil here, and I'm adding a little bit of shading to either side of the hat. And on the top portion, I guess the very top of the top hat, I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to the back portion of it, again, to differentiate between the little sections of the hat. For the brim, I'm going to add a little bit of shading towards where it's coming from behind the hat, but I'm leaving a little bit of space there for a highlight. So I don't want it to all be black. I'm going to go in with some more cool grays. This time I'm going in with the very dark cool grays, and I'm going to blend that out towards the center a little bit. And I'm not leaving too much of a highlight here. Like I said, I'm not all that comfortable with pencils, so the scary lights and the scary darks and things that I talk about with the Copics, I'm not comfortable enough to totally use them yet with the colored pencils, but I'm working on it. So for the snowman's arms, these little sticks here, I'm just going to use two different colors, and I'm pretty much just adding shading where the little branches, I guess you could call them, come together with the rest of the branch. And I'm just going to blend that out with that lighter brown. So next we're going to move on to the everything else. And we're going to be using some blues here. So the hats and the scarves are all going to have the same color combination. So my darkest blue here is the Helio Blue Reddish. My midtones, I use a total of 5 here, is the Cobalt Blue Greenish. Then the Ultramarine. And the lightest midtone is the light ultramarine. And then I finished off with that sky blue, the same sky blue that we used for the snow. So I'm just adding some shading for this little cat. Everything is going to have the shading off to the left-hand side. And again, going in with a very light hand with those shadow colors. Then once I bring in that lightest blue, I can kind of go in with a heavier hand, and I'm going over the entire thing. Now for the little ends of the scarves, the fringy part of it, I'm saving that till last. And I'm not doing any shading on the individual little pieces, but I'm adding them in the same order, I guess you could say, as the blues that I used. So in the darker areas, that little fringy part is going to be with the darker blues, and where the highlight is, it's going to be the lighter blues. So I'm going to continue on coloring the scarf for the little bunny as well as the scarf for the snowman with the same color combination. For some of those areas, you kind of had to switch up my light source, to be quite honest, just so that my darkest areas weren't touching one another. So for this little bunny, where the two pieces of the scarf are hanging down, one is behind the other, so that's obviously going to cast a shadow, but I didn't want to place my shading to the right hand side because then I would have had two shadows directly next to one another. For the snowman, again, going to add the shading to the right hand side, and for the part that's actually around his neck, you can see that I'm going in with a little bit of a flick on either side, and this is just going to give it a little bit of texture. Now once I go into the darkest mid-tone, I'm going to extend those areas out, and I'm also going to add shading to the bottom part of the area of the scarf that's wrapped around him, but I'm leaving just a little bit of space between the outline of the stamped image and where I'm placing down that color. Again, so that I don't have those two dark areas directly touching. There's just going to be a tiny bit of a highlight, and this will kind of separate the two little sections of that scarf. So again, going to finish off with that lightest color, going in with a pretty heavy hand to kind of blend everything out, and then I'll add that little fringy area same way as I did for the scarf on the cat. So for the next we're going to move on to the carrot nose, and I'm going to use 3 different oranges for this as well. And for the darkest orange, which is orange glaze, I'm going to add the little lines within the carrot with a very heavy hand. So again, when I go in and blend and have some contrast to the actual image, I'm not blending those areas out. The mid-tone was cadmium orange, and the lightest was the dark chrome orange. For the white sections of his hat, I was originally going to use cool grays, but decided no, blending in way too much with everything else. So I ended up bringing in some very light warm grays and just added a little bit of shading to either side. And then I'll finish off with the white pencil. Obviously, this area is white, but we do want to add some of that shading. Last, I'm going to go ahead and fill in the bow of the hat, and I'm going to use the same blues. I was a little worried about this because I kind of lost my lines and I didn't know what I was doing. So I brought in the packaging and I'm just using that as a reference so that I know exactly how this was supposed to be placed. And I just added a little bit of shading where the bow is actually bunched together, and then on either side of the ribbon that is actually going around the hat. So once all of my coloring was done, I'm going to go ahead and add some white gel pen details to everything. And like I always say, this is really going to boost up your coloring. So if you're not all that happy with your coloring, which to be honest with you, I wasn't unhappy, but I could have done better, I feel. So adding a few white gel pen details will really boost that up and make it look even better than it actually is. Going to take some Fun Foam. I like to use the stuff that has the adhesive on one side, and honestly, I just buy this stuff at Walmart, and adding some Tombow Mono Multi Glue to the back of that and placing that down on a white top folding A2 size note card. And didn't leave room for a sentiment, or actually now that everything's adhered, it would be kind of hard to add one. So a sentiment will go in the inside. But that is it. That's the card for today, guys. Thanks so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.